Hey guys, tonight we start in a farmhouse kitchen in Mansfield, Missouri, on the 20th of October, 1948. There's a contract on the table. Laura Ingalls Wilder is 81 years old. She's sitting in a house she and Almanzo built room by room across 18 years, and she's signing it away. $2,000 down, $50 a month after that, no interest. The buyers are a farming couple who live nearby, Harland and Girida Shorter. Under this agreement, they now own the farmhouse, the yard, the barn, the orchard rows, and the ground under all of it. There's one more clause further down, and it matters more than the money. Laura and Almanzo may go on living here until they die. That's the whole arrangement. They sold their home, kept the right to sleep in it, and handed over the deed while the kettle was still on the stove. By 1948, the Little House books had been in print 16 years. They sold steadily. Schools had them. Libraries had them. Money was coming in, and it wasn't a small amount of money for two old people living quietly in the Ozarks. So nobody made her do this. That's the part that stops you. If these quiet histories help you sleep, subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Our three little books live at prairiesecrets.com. On a television, just scan the QR code on your screen. On a phone, the links are in the description and the pinned comment. And if you drift off before the end, that's what this is for. I'll keep watch. Alright, here's what happened to all of it. Almanzo died in that house a year later, in October of 1949. Laura lived on alone for another 7 years. She died in it on the 10th of February 1957, 3 days after her 90th birthday, in a bedroom that legally belonged to somebody else. Her will left the income from her books to her daughter Rose, for the length of Rose's life. After Rose, all of it was to go to the small branch library in Mansfield that carried Laura's name. Rose died 11 years later. She had no children, and her own will left everything she owned to a man who wasn't related to her, or to Laura, or to any Ingalls who ever lived. So the farm went to neighbours, the books went to a stranger, and the library that Laura Ingalls Wilder named in her own will spent the next 44 years trying to get hold of what she'd left it. That's where everything went. That's the answer, and that's the whole shape of it. What it doesn't tell you is why. Why would a woman who spent her whole life writing about a family's home give her own away before she had finished living in it? The answer isn't money. It's a colder kind of arithmetic. And to see it, you have to count who was left. Laura had one child who lived. Rose was born in December of 1886 in a claim shanty on the Dakota Prairie. 3 years later, there was a second baby, a boy, born in the middle of July 1889. He lived 4 weeks. Rose grew up, she married, she moved to San Francisco and then further, and she became the more famous of the two women for most of her life. In November of 1909 in Salt Lake City, she gave birth to a son. He came at about 6 months and he died the same day. The cemetery register lists him as Infant Lane. There's no first name in the book because there was never any time to use one. Rose never had another child. Her marriage ended. She didn't marry again. So on that October afternoon in 1948, with a pen in her hand, Laura Ingalls Wilder could count the entire future of her family on 2 fingers. Herself, and a 61-year-old woman in Connecticut who had no children and wasn't going to have any. Her sisters were already gone. Mary died in 1928, Grace in 1941, Carrie in 1946, 2 years before this contract. And here is the fact that people find hardest to believe when they first hear it. Between the 4 Ingalls daughters, across 3 marriages, there was exactly 1 child born who reached adulthood. That child buried her only baby in 1909 and lived another 59 years without another. 4 sisters, 1 grandchild who lived to grow up. No great-grandchildren at all. People ask about this constantly, and the honest answer has several parts. Mary never married. She was blind from the age of 14. She came home from the Iowa College for the Blind at 24. And she lived with her mother and then with her sister for the rest of her life. Marriage wasn't really on offer to a blind woman without money in Dakota territory, and there's no evidence she wanted it. Grace married Nathan Dow in 1901 and farmed with him near Manchester for 40 years. No children. Carrie didn't marry until she was 42. When she did, she married a widower with 2 young children and raised them. She had none of her own. And Laura had Rose, and Rose had a grave marker in Salt Lake City with no name on it. Now, people also ask whether the hunger did it. Whether the starving winters, the diphtheria, the years of not enough food broke something in these girls' bodies. And the honest answer is that nobody can say. There's no medical record that would settle it. What the evidence supports is the pattern, not the cause. 4 daughters, 1 grandchild, nothing after. One more thing, because this argument runs in every comment section I've ever read about this family. There are people alive today named Ingalls who are related to Charles. That's true. Charles had brothers and sisters, and they had children, and those lines ran on and are running still. But they don't come down through him. Charles Philip Ingalls has no living descendants. Caroline has none. The line that walks out of the big woods in the first book, the 5 people at that table, stops in a bedroom in Connecticut in 1968. Which is what Laura was looking at in 1948, when the contract came out. There was nobody to leave a farm to. That's not a sad fact for its own sake. It's a practical one. And if you've ever stood in a house and thought about who is going to want the things in it, you already know the shape of the problem. Because a farm isn't money. A farm is work that somebody has to do every single morning. Look at what Rocky Ridge actually was by 1948. Close to 200 acres of Ozark hillside, an apple orchard, outbuildings, fences, a spring, a road that washed out, a 10-room farmhouse that had been added to so many times it had stopped having a single plan. Laura was 75 when the selling started. Almanzo was 86, and he had walked with a cane since 1888. When diphtheria went into his nervous system and took the strength out of his left leg and never gave it back. And I want you to see what they were actually letting go of, because the word farm does a lot of hiding. Rocky Ridge wasn't a house with a field behind it. It was a business, and by the 1940s it was an old business run by 2 very old people. There was the orchard, apple trees planted in rows, Almanzo laid out with stakes and string in the 1890s. An orchard isn't a thing you own, it's a thing you attend. Pruning in the late winter, grafting, watching for blight, picking, which is ladder work, which is exactly the work a man with a bad leg can't do. There was the dairy end of it. Cows get milked twice a day, morning and evening, every day, including Christmas, including the day you're ill. There were the hens. Laura's poultry was the thing that first made her name outside Wright County. Long before any book. She knew more about laying hens than most men in that county, and she wrote about it in the farm papers. Hens have to be fed, watered, shut in at dusk and let out at dawn, and the eggs have to be collected while they're clean. There was a garden, and a spring, and fences, and a road that washed out when it rained hard. Now put an 86-year-old man with a cane and a 75-year-old woman in the middle of that and ask the honest question. Who's doing it next year? Not Rose. Rose was in Connecticut and had made it very clear across 40 years that she wasn't coming back to be a farmer's daughter, not a grandchild, because there wasn't one, not a nephew or a niece on the Ingalls side, because those don't exist either. So it goes to hired men, until it doesn't, and then it goes to seed, and then somebody sells it in a hurry after a funeral for whatever they can get. They'd both seen that happen. They'd watched it happen to other people's places their entire adult lives. A farm outliving the people who can work it is one of the oldest quiet tragedies in rural America, and they knew the shape of it by heart, so they didn't let it get there. 3 sales, 1943 twice, 1948 once, and in the middle of it, a clause that let them stay. That's not somebody being cheated out of a farm. That's a couple doing the arithmetic and then doing something about it while they still could. And this was the place she'd bought herself. That deserves saying properly, because it's the hinge of the whole story. In September of 1894, a wagon came down out of Dakota carrying a woman of 27, a disabled man of 37, and a 7-year-old girl. They bought 40 acres of rocky timber for $400 from a couple named White. The deed was made out in the name Laura E. Wilder. Not Almanzo's name, hers. And they took on a mortgage of $140 owed to the Stark brothers' nursery for apple trees that wouldn't bear for 7 years. That's how it began. 40 acres, a $100 bill hidden in a writing desk, and a debt for trees. 54 years later, she was selling the last of it for $2,000 down. They had already started letting go 5 years before that. In January of 1943, they sold the rock house and the 40 acres it stood on. The rock house deserves its own minute, because of who built it. Rose put it up in 1928 as a present for her parents, on a 40-acre parcel the family had bought 9 years earlier from a man named Grant Morgan for $1,500. It was an English cottage design ordered out of a Sears Roebuck catalogue. It had electric light. It had a modern kitchen. It had a bathroom indoors, which the farmhouse did not. Rose was doing well then, better than her parents had ever done, and this was what she did with it. Laura and Almanzo moved in and lived there 8 years, and then they moved out and walked back down the hill to the old farmhouse, back to the hand pump, back to the wood range, back to the low ceilings and the counters Almanzo had cut down to suit a wife who was 4 feet 11. Nobody wrote down why. You can guess, and most people do, and the guesses say more about the guesser than about Laura. What the record shows is the movement. They took the modern house and then they gave it up and went home. They kept the rock house another 7 years without living in it. Then they sold it. In November of that same year, they sold 30 more acres, the piece they always called the Hill. Then 5 years passed and the rest went, on that October afternoon in 1948. $50 a month in 1948 was about what a hired man earned in 2 weeks. It wasn't nothing, but it was less than the books were bringing in, and both of them knew it. So what were they actually buying with that sale? They were buying the end of responsibility. They were buying the certainty that when it was over, nobody would have to come and clear it out. Almanzo went first. He had a heart attack in the spring of 1949. He recovered enough to be up and about the place through the summer. On the 23rd of October, he had another one, and that was the end of it. He was 92. He had been married to Laura for 64 years. They buried him in the Mansfield cemetery, about a mile and a half from the kitchen door. And this is where the story quietly changes hands. Because from October of 1949, there's one Ingalls left alive on Earth. She is 82. She lives alone in a house that isn't hers. Neighbours came. A woman came in to help with the cooking and the cleaning. She kept the place going in the smallest way she could. A few chickens, the garden nearest the door, and the letters kept coming. That's the part of her last years people know least about, and it's worth slowing down for. By 1949, the Little House books had been in American schools for more than a decade, which meant that somewhere between 8 and 11 years old, an enormous number of American children read about a girl called Laura, and then found out at the back of the book that she was real, that she was alive, and that you could write to her. So they did. They wrote from everywhere. They asked whether Jack the dog was real. They asked what happened to Mary. They asked whether Nellie Olson was a real girl and whether she was really that awful. They asked what Ma looked like. A lot of them asked, in the way children do, whether she was lonely, and she answered them. Not all of them, in the end. Nobody could have. But she answered them for years, in her own hand, one at a time, at a desk in a house she didn't own, in her 80s, with arthritis in the fingers she needed. She had no grandchildren. She had no great-grandchildren. She had a daughter in Connecticut who wrote and visited, and who was, by then, an old woman herself. And every week the postman brought her children, and what she sent back was ordinary. That's the part that gets you. There's no performance in it. She answered the question that had been asked, in plain words, and signed her name. I keep coming back to one small practical fact about it. She paid for the stamps, an old woman on $50 a month and a book income, buying postage year after year to answer letters from strangers' children who'd grow up and have children of their own and read them the same books. That's a person handing something forward with no legal mechanism at all. No will, no trust, no copyright, just an envelope. And when her hand finally went and she couldn't write anymore, the letters didn't stop coming. They just stopped being answered. Through all of those years, every month the Shorters paid $50 into her account, and every month she went on living in their house. There's something in that arrangement people miss the first time they hear it. A life estate isn't charity. It's a bet, and both sides understand the terms. The buyer pays less than the place is worth because he can't use it yet. The seller stays because she isn't going to be here long. Laura Ingalls Wilder made that bet at 81 and won it for 9 more years. She died on the 10th of February 1957. She had turned 93 days before. Rose came down from Connecticut. She'd been away a long time and she had complicated feelings about Mansfield. None of that mattered now because there were arrangements to make. So here's what Laura actually owned when she died. She owned her books. That was the substantial part, and it really was substantial. She owned furniture, dishes, linens, her mother's things, her father's things, the accumulated objects of a family that had carried what it could out of Wisconsin in a wagon and never quite stopped moving. And she owned her papers, which turned out to be worth more than anybody in that house understood. She did not own the house. She did not own the land. On the day Laura Ingalls Wilder died, the most famous farm in American children's literature belonged to a couple named Shorter, who had bought it fairly, paid for it monthly, and waited. Then the will was read. Its central provision was short, and it was also, in its way, remarkable. All income from her copyrighted literary property was to go to Rose during her natural life, and after Rose, that income was to go to the Laura Ingalls Wilder Library in Mansfield, Missouri, not to a university, not to a foundation with a board and a letterhead, to the branch library in a town of about 1,000 people, in the county where she had kept hens and written a farm column, and eventually written 8 books about being a child. She was leaving the whole thing to the room where the books lived. We should be careful here. It would be easy to put words in her mouth about why she did that, and I'm not going to. No letter survives in which she explains this choice. No speech. Nothing where she sets out her thinking about her estate. What survives is the document, and the document isn't ambiguous. The books went to Rose for Rose's lifetime. Then they went to the town. Hold on to that. Everything else tonight runs off it. Because there's one thing she did in her own lifetime that tells you she had thought about this before. Some years earlier, Laura gave away a manuscript. Not to a museum, not to a university. She sent the longhand manuscript of The Long Winter to the Detroit Public Library in Michigan, a city she'd visited once. It went into a collection of local history papers, and she did it herself while she was alive to do it. It's still there. That's the same instinct 20 years early. When she had something she couldn't hand to a child, she handed it to a library. Now Rose. Within weeks of her mother's funeral, Rose Wilder Lane went to Harland and Girarda Shorter and asked to buy the farmhouse back, not the farm. She didn't want 200 acres of hillside. She wanted the house and 3 acres of ground around it. The Shorters agreed. The price was $7,500. Rose paid it out of her own pocket, and then she gave it away. She handed the house to a group of local people who had come together within days of the funeral. 6 of them at the start, temporary trustees, ordinary Mansfield men, a grocer, a banker, neighbours. One of them was Harlan Shorter, who had just sold the place back. They called themselves the Laura Ingalls Wilder Home Association. And here's what we should be clear about, because it's usually skipped. The alternative wasn't that the house got knocked down. Nobody knocks down a good farmhouse. The alternative was completely ordinary. The Shorters owned it. The Shorters would move in, or rent it out, or sell it on. Somebody would live there. They'd put a new stove in and take the old shelves down and get rid of the furniture, because that's what you do with a house you've bought, and the objects would go where objects go. Some to a relative, except there wasn't one, some to a sale, some to the dump. That's the normal outcome. It happens to almost every house in America. What stopped it was a handful of people moving fast, and look at who was in the room. A grocer, a banker, neighbours, and Harlan Shorter, the man who actually owned the place, sitting on the committee that wanted it back from him. That tells you something about him that no document records. They had no money. They had no legal charter yet. What they had was a house full of an old woman's belongings and an instinct that these things should not be scattered. The first open house was on Sunday, the 19th of May, 1957, 3 months and 9 days after she died. 500 people walked through her kitchen. Think about what that room looked like that afternoon. The stove she cooked on, the counters cut down to reach, the window over the sink, her writing desk, her spectacles, wherever she had set them, and 500 strangers in their Sunday clothes, moving through it in a line. The association made a decision that day that turned out to be worth more than money. They left everything where it was. They didn't curate. They didn't build a display. They kept the house as a house, with the objects sitting where Laura had put them down. And that single decision is the reason most of what we're going to talk about tonight still exists. Rose kept paying. She shipped furniture and papers down from Connecticut and from Texas. She paid for a house to be built on the grounds for the curators, a couple named Lichty, who moved in and looked after the place. That house was finished in 1963, and in 1970 the association looked hard at the wooden farmhouse and did the sum that every small museum eventually has to do. The manuscripts were in there, the fragile things were in there, and the building was a 100-year-old frame house with a wood stove history and no fire protection at all. They needed somewhere that wouldn't burn. A man stepped forward and helped pay for it. The Fireproof Museum opened in 1971. His name was Roger Lee McBride, and he had inherited everything from Rose 3 years earlier. Hold on to that name. He comes back, and when he does, everything turns. In 1991, the farmhouse was made a National Historic Landmark, which is the category the country keeps for places it decides it can't afford to lose. The rock house, the one Rose built and her parents walked away from, eventually came back to the association too, and opened to visitors in 1997. Today the site runs to about 150 acres, and it holds around 3,000 objects. None of the people who look after them are relatives, but Rocky Ridge is only half of what this family left behind. The other half is 900 miles north, in a town Charles Ingalls helped survey, in a house he built with his own hands, and it went out of the family too. De Smet. Let's go back to June of 1886. Caroline Ingalls buys a lot in town, not Charles, Caroline. The record says Lot 12, Block 10, in Brown's Addition, and her name is on it. Look at that for a second. In 1886, a married woman putting her own name on a town lot is a deliberate act, and it comes at the end of nearly 30 years of following her husband to places that didn't work out. Wisconsin, Missouri, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, Minnesota again, Dakota Territory. Charles built the house on that lot the following year in 1887. He didn't build it all at once. He built what he could afford and then added on, and the adding went on until about 1889. It's a plain frame house on a corner. 2 stories, a porch. Nothing about it announces anything, and here is what it was for. It was for stopping. Charles Ingalls was 51 years old when he built that house, and he had moved his family by a conservative count more than a dozen times. He never moved again. He lived there 15 years and he died in it on the 8th of June, 1902, at 66. Caroline stayed. She stayed 22 more years. She died in that house on Easter Sunday, the 20th of April, 1924. So what happened to it? Carrie got it. Caroline Celestia Ingalls, the middle daughter, born in Kansas in 1870, the frail one, the one who was sick so often that the family half expected to lose her. She'd gone up to Keystone in the Black Hills in 1911, married a widower named David Swansea there the following year, and taken on his 2 children. She inherited her mother's house and she owned it for 20 years without ever living in it. Mary came out to Keystone to live with Carrie, and it was in Keystone, not Smet, that Mary Ingalls died on the 17th of October 1928 after a stroke. That correction matters. You'll read in 100 places that Mary died in the family home. She didn't. She died in her sister's house in a mining town under the Black Hills, 400 miles from the parlour she grew up in. In 1944, Carrie let the De Smet house go to a family named Ferguson. She was 74. Grace had been dead 3 years. Mary 16. Nobody needed a house in De Smet. So the last address Charles Ingalls ever had passed to a family with no connection to any of it. And for close to 30 years it was simply somebody's home. People slept in those rooms, argued in them, hung pictures, painted over things. Carrie died on the 2nd of June 1946 in Rapid City of complications from diabetes. She was 75, and with that, every single person who had ever lived in that house was dead. Now hold that thought, because there's a second building in De Smet, and its story tells you something the first one can't. The Surveyors' house. If you know the books, you know it as the place where the family spent the winter of 1879, the first Dakota winter, alone by Silver Lake with a railroad camp's worth of supplies, and nobody else for miles. It wasn't built for them. The Chicago and Northwestern Railroad put it up over the summer of 1879 to a standard section house plan drawn by one of the company's engineers on another man's tree claim by the lake. The Ingalls were caretakers. They moved in at the start of December and stayed until spring. Then the railroad was done with it. In 1884, somebody hauled the building into town and it became a house like any other house. And this is where it gets interesting, because the deeds survive, and they read like a small, sad ledger of how a place loses its meaning. In May of 1893, it sold for $112.50. In 1898, a dying man transferred it to his wife for, in the words of the deed, natural love and affection, and $1. It went round the town like that for 50 years. Somebody put siding on it. Somebody put in plumbing and dug a basement underneath, because it was a house, and houses need those things. In 1947, it sold for $2,750, and then in August of 1967, the newly formed Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society bought it for $2,350, $400 less than it had gone for 20 years earlier. Read that again, because it's the whole point. In 1967, the building where the Ingalls family spent their first winter in Dakota Territory was worth less than it had been in 1947. The market didn't know what it was. Nobody had told the market yet. The society opened it to visitors in June of 1969 at the town's Old Settlers' Day. And the townhouse on 3rd Street, the one Carrie let go in 1944, the Memorial Society brought that back too by the early 1970s. It went onto the National Register in April of 1975. The nomination form lists the architect as Charles Philip Ingalls, which is the only time I know of that a carpenter with no training and no money got written into a federal register as an architect. In 1977, they put a new foundation under it and dug a basement, because the ground had been moving for 90 years. And there are two things inside those two buildings that say more than the deeds do. In the Surveyor's house, there's a chest of drawers. Charles made it. Not bought, not ordered, made with hand tools by a man who was a carpenter when there was carpentry work and a farmer when there wasn't. Think about what a chest of drawers is for. It's for a family that has stopped. You don't build furniture for a wagon. You build it when you've decided the clothes are going to live in one place from now on. He built that thing at least twice in his life for houses they then left. And in the townhouse on 3rd Street, over the door, there's a gun. That rifle is the reason several of these people lived through some winters. It shot rabbits and prairie chickens and, when it had to, deer. In the hungriest stretch of 1881, it was one of the 2 or 3 things standing between that family and something much worse than hunger. It hangs over a door now, in a room where the temperature is controlled, and it hasn't been fired in 120 years. So there they are. 2 Ingalls buildings in De Smet. Both of them out of the family for decades. Both bought back by committees of people who weren't related to a single Ingalls. That's a pattern. It repeats, and it's going to matter enormously by the time we finish tonight. But buildings are the easy part. Buildings sit still and can be bought. Objects move. Objects get given away and used up and put in a box and sold at a farm auction on a Saturday morning to whoever raises a hand. So let's go and find them. Start at the beginning in Wisconsin, because the first house is the one nobody can find. Charles Ingalls bought 80 acres of timber in Pepin County in the 1860s. He built a cabin on it around 1863, and his wife's brother Henry Quiner helped him raise it, because that's how a cabin got built when you had no money and a neighbour had arms. Laura was born in that cabin on the 7th of February, 1867. They sold the farm in 1872, and then the cabin simply disappears from the record. There's a suggestion it stood on as an outbuilding into the 1920s, somebody's shed, somewhere to keep tools out of the rain. After that, nothing. No photograph anybody trusts, no demolition date, no account of who pulled it down or whether it just fell. The most famous little house in America came apart quietly on a Wisconsin farm and nobody thought to write down when. There's a cabin there now. It was built in 1978 by a local memorial society. On 3 acres the town's business people and the landowner put together. It's a replica. It's honest about being a replica. You can go and stand in it. It's the right size. It's in roughly the right place. And it's made entirely of wood that never saw any of these people. Now Minnesota, because Minnesota is where the accounting turns cruel. The family came to Plum Creek in May of 1874 and lived in a dugout cut into the creek bank. Then Charles built a frame house on credit against a wheat crop, and the grasshoppers came and the wheat went twice. They left in July of 1876. Here is the transaction, and I want you to hear the numbers in order. They bought the land outright from the government. It cost $413, and they immediately sold it to a man named Abraham Keller for $400. $13 lost in the space of the same set of papers. That's what 2 years of a family's life on Plum Creek came to on the ledger. They paid to own it and then paid $13 for the privilege of getting out. The dugout is gone, not knocked down, gone. A dugout is a hole with a roof, and when nobody maintains it, the bank comes in and takes it back. What's there today is a depression in the ground beside the creek, a dip. You'd walk past it. And here's the part I like. In 1947, a couple named Harold and Della Gordon bought a 172-acre farm in that township. They bought it because it was a farm. They had no idea what was on it. In November of that year, a man came out to see them carrying records he'd copied at the county courthouse. His name was Garth Williams. He was an illustrator. He'd been hired to draw the pictures for a new edition of the Little House books, and he'd decided that before he drew a single line, he'd go and look at every place it happened. So a farm couple in Minnesota found out what they owned from an artist with a folder of deeds. They kept it. Since 1999, about 25 acres around the dent in the bank have been replanted with native prairie grasses. It's open from May to October in daylight, and there's nothing to see, and people come anyway. Then Dakota. And Dakota is where the family finally owned something, and then had to prove it. Charles filed his homestead claim in February of 1880 at the land office in Brookings, 157¼ acres. The filing fees came to $16. $16 for the legal right to try. That's what the whole thing cost at the front end, and everything after it was labour. You had to live on the ground, improve it, stay 5 years, then swear to all of it in front of witnesses, and publish a notice in the paper so anybody who wanted to object could. He proved up in 1886. The declaration ran in the Smet News, which is the closest thing this family ever had to a public announcement that they had won something. The land is still there. Part of the old claim is a working visitor site today, owned by a family called Sullivan, who aren't related to anybody here and who bought it and made something of it. Another parcel, the one with the cottonwood ground on it, came to the Memorial Society as a gift from a Mr. and Mrs. Edward May. And there's one thing on that homestead I haven't told you about yet, and it's the one I think about most. Charles planted 5 cottonwood trees. Not an orchard, not a windbreak, though it worked as one. 5 trees, and the story that came down with them is that he planted one for Caroline and one for each of the 4 girls. Cottonwoods grow fast, which is why people planted them out there. They're not a fine wood. You can't build much with them, and they don't burn well. What they do is get big quickly and make shade in a place that has none. So a man with no money puts 5 saplings in the ground on a claim he doesn't own yet, and names them after his wife and daughters, and waits. They grew. People who went out to that ground in the 1920s and 30s wrote about them. There are photographs. Visitors stood under them. 40 years after the last Ingalls left to Smet, the trees Charles planted were still standing, and they were the tallest thing on that section, and people drove out specifically to see them. They're gone now. Cottonwoods don't live all that long. 100 years is a good run for one. Nobody cut them down in a scandal. They just did what cottonwoods do, one after another, and the ground went back to being flat. Which is the whole story of this family in one small living thing. He planted something for the women in his house. It outlived him by decades. It outlived every one of them, and then it went too, quietly, without anybody able to stop it. There are trees on that land today. They were planted later, by people who wanted the ground to look the way it looked in the photographs, which is not the same thing at all, and it's still the nearest anyone can get. Planted, again, by people who were not related to him. And now New York, because there's one more property and half of you have been waiting for it. The Wilder farm at Malone. If you've read Farmer Boy, you've been inside that house. The pancakes, the pumpkin, the father's watch. It was a real farm and it's still standing, a post and beam farmhouse put up around 1840. The Wilders left it in 1875 and went west. And then, for 112 years, nobody who cared knew who had it. Almanzo's family sold and moved. The place was farmed by other people, generation after generation, the way farms are. Nobody has written down that chain. It's simply a gap, a century wide, in which somebody's grandfather kept cows in the barn where Almanzo Wilder learned to break a colt. In June of 1987, a group incorporated itself to buy it, and they did. 84 acres. They have been putting it back room by room ever since, using period materials and period methods, which is slow and expensive, and the only honest way to do it. And there are more towns, because this family moved more than almost anybody wants to count. Burr Oak, Iowa, 1876. That's the year everybody skips, and Laura skipped it too. After the grasshoppers took Minnesota, and after the baby brother died in 1876, the family went east instead of west. They'd never done that before, and they ran a hotel in Burr Oak for a man named Stedman. Not owned, ran. The Ingalls lived in the back of somebody else's hotel and worked it. Charles was in his 40s and he was a hotel man's employee. It's in none of the 8 books. The building is still standing on the main street. It's a museum now, run by a local society, and the rooms they show you are the rooms the family actually lived in, which is more than most of these sites can say. Spring Valley, Minnesota. That's the Wilder side, where Laura and Almanzo went in 1890, after the fire and the baby and the illness, when there was nowhere else to go. And it's where the Ingalls family Bible record ended up. In a case, in a small Minnesota town no member of this family ever considered home. We'll come back to what's written in it. Independence, Kansas. The Prairie, the one everybody knows the name of. 2 years, from 1869, on land they had no legal right to be on. There's a reconstructed cabin on that site now, built from the dimensions in the book and the archaeology of a well and a hearth. Nobody in the family ever went back, and then to Smet and Mansfield and Pepin and Walnut Grove and Malone in New York. Count them up. 8 places, 8 towns that decided at various points across the 20th century to buy or rebuild or preserve a house that this family had passed through. Now ask the obvious question. Who paid for that? Not the estate. The estate is a trust in somebody's law office, and it owns the words, not the walls. Local people paid for it. Church committees and chambers of commerce and retired teachers, and the farm wife who ran the gift shop on Saturdays. Towns of 1 or 2 or 4,000 people, putting money they didn't have into a building because a woman had once written about it. 8 towns, 8 societies, 8 sets of volunteers, and not one relative among them. That's not preservation in the way a wealthy family preserves things. There's no endowment behind most of it. It's bake sales and admission fees and somebody's husband fixing the roof. It has held that way for 70 years. And there's a thing Smet does every summer that I can't get out of my head. Since the early 1970s, the town has put on an outdoor pageant of the Ingalls story. Out on the homestead ground, in the evening, under the sky, in front of grandstands. It's performed by the town, not actors, not a touring company. Local people who have day jobs, who audition in the spring and rehearse through June. Which means that every summer for more than 50 years, a girl from Smet, South Dakota, has put on a dress and a bonnet and played Laura Ingalls. Somebody's daughter plays Mary. Somebody's husband plays Charles and has to learn to hold the fiddle right, whether or not he can play a note. And then they grow up and stop, and the next lot come along. Think about the arithmetic. 50 years of it. That's a couple of generations of children in one small South Dakota town who have, at some point, been in Ingalls for a week. The family that stopped in 1968 had no descendants at all. But every June, in the town where they finally stopped moving, a few hundred people who are not related to them get up on a piece of prairie and be them for a night. Nobody's pretending that's a bloodline. But whatever it is, it has now outlasted the copyrights, the lawsuit, and the man who owned all of it. So that's the real estate. Wisconsin, gone and rebuilt from nothing. Minnesota, a dent in a creek bank. Kansas, which was never theirs at all. Iowa, Missouri, Dakota, New York, all of it eventually in the hands of people with other surnames. Now the things you can pick up. Start with the organ, because the organ tells you what this family was. In the spring of 1884, Mary Ingalls got an organ. She was 19. She'd been blind for 5 years. She'd come home from the Iowa College for the Blind for the summer, and the family bought her an instrument, and the money came mostly out of Laura's wages. Laura was 17. She'd been teaching school and sewing in town, and she handed her earnings over. The organ cost $100. Now hold that against the rest of this family's ledger. The homestead claim, 157 acres of Dakota, cost $16 to file. 4 years later, they spent $100 so a blind girl could put her hands on something and make a sound come out of it. That's the family. That's exactly the family in one purchase. So where is it? Gone. Sometime after Mary's death, the organ was given away to a woman remembered now only as Thelma. And at some point after that, it was sold at a farm auction. Not a museum, not a collector. A farmyard, a crowd, an auctioneer, and somebody who wanted an old pump organ and got one cheap. Nobody knows who bought it. Nobody knows where it stands tonight, if it stands anywhere at all. Could it still be out there? Somebody's front room, somebody's barn, under a sheet? Maybe. A pump organ that nobody knows is important is just a heavy piece of furniture. And here's the part that will bother you. If you go to Rocky Ridge Farm today, there's an organ on display. For years it was labelled as Mary's. It was printed in books as Mary's. It isn't. That instrument was built in 1890. Mary's was bought in 1884. 6 years too late. It can't be the same object, and it never was. So for decades, visitors stood in front of a cottage organ built in 1890. They thought about a blind girl in Dakota, and they felt something completely real about an instrument that had nothing to do with her. I don't think that's a scandal. I think it's what happens to a family's things when the family stops. Somebody has to remember which one it was, and eventually nobody does. Here's one that survived, and it survived a fire. There's a bread plate in the museum at Mansfield. Pressed glass, heads of wheat around the rim, and across the middle in stippled letters the words, "Give us this day our daily bread." It was made by McKeon Brothers in Pittsburgh. The pattern is called City. It came out in 1881 and was in the catalogue by 1882. It was a Christmas present, and in August of 1889, when Laura and Almanzo's house in Smet burned to the ground with almost everything they owned inside it, that plate came out of the fire. Look at what that month was. The baby was born on the 11th of July. He died on the 7th of August. The house burned about 2 weeks after that, The crop that year had already failed. Almanzo's leg had gone the year before. Out of all of that, out of a season that took a child, a home, a harvest, and a man's health. One glass plate came through. It's sitting under lights in Missouri tonight, with the wheat head still sharp on the rim. Years later, a researcher tracked down 2 small sauce dishes in the same pattern from the same Christmas set, and they were put back beside it, reunited on a shelf, about a century late. And then there's the desk. Almanzo made it. A portable writing desk, the kind you set on your knees, made by a man who could do fine work with his hands right up until his hands started shaking. Laura carried it from South Dakota to Missouri in a covered wagon in 1894, and inside it, in a hiding place, she carried a $100 bill. That $100 was 2 years of sewing. 25 cents for a dress, 10 cents for a shirt. 40 towels on a good day at a treadle machine on Main Street into Smet, 6 days a week, while her husband did what he could with a leg that gave out on him quickly. That single bill was the down payment on the 40 acres that became Rocky Ridge. The museum has recreated the hiding place with a printed bill inside it, because visitors kept asking where it was. So there's a small, strange truth in that display case. The $100 is fake. The desk is real, and the hole in the desk is the most important thing in the room. Then there's the Shepherdess. If you've read the books, you know her. The little China woman who came out of the packing at every new house. The one Ma set on a shelf as the sign that a place had turned into a home. There's a figurine at the Keystone Area Historical Society in South Dakota, found among Carrie's belongings, and Laura wrote in a letter that Carrie had it. But the figure is a problem. People who have looked closely say it appears to be a shepherd, not a shepherdess. Gilt shoes, breeches, more of a courtier than a country girl with a crook. And the deeper problem is in the manuscripts. In The Handwritten Pioneer Girl, the autobiography Laura wrote for adults before any of the novels existed, there's no China woman on a shelf at all. She turns up in the Bigwoods manuscript as a little China woman. She only becomes a shepherdess in the printed book, so the most emotionally loaded object in the entire Little House world may be a shepherd. Or it may be a memory reshaped somewhere between a pencil draft and a publisher. And the one physical candidate for it sits in a converted schoolhouse in a mining town in the Black Hills. The object that meant home turns out to be slightly out of focus. It goes on meaning home anyway. There's a 9-patch quilt at Mansfield that Mary made. 9-patch is the simplest block in quilting, 9 squares in a grid, which is exactly why a blind woman would use it. Same shapes, same order, every single time, so your hands can keep count of what your eyes can't check. She could not see the colours she was putting next to each other. Somebody handed her the pieces in an order somebody else had chosen, and it came out right. That quilt is a blind woman's whole method laid out flat. Do the part you can do. Do it exactly. Trust the person handing you the pieces. She had 49 years of practice at that after the fever, and every one of them was spent in somebody else's house. And there's a Bible, or rather there's a set of pages, the Ingalls family record, marriages going back to 1831, births from 1832, deaths from 1876 onward. The deaths column runs all the way to 1957, which means somebody sat down after Laura Ingalls Wilder died and wrote her death into the family Bible in the correct column, in order, the way it had been done for 126 years. There was no one left in the family to do it, so somebody else did. Now let's take Grace. Grace Pearl Ingalls was the baby, born in Smet in May of 1877, the only one of the 5 children born after they stopped moving. She married Nathan Dow in October of 1901, in the front room of her parents' house on 3rd Street, with her father alive and 8 months left to live. They farmed near Manchester, 6 or 7 miles west of Smet, a small place, the kind of place that exists because a railroad needed a siding. Grace died on the 10th of November 1941. Nathan died 2.5 years later. The house came down at some point after that. Nobody wrote down when, and when it came down, the Memorial Society in Smet took the boards. They sawed them into thin slices, and they sold them in the gift shop. You could buy a piece of Grace Ingalls Dow's house for a few dollars, take it home in your pocket and put it in a drawer. I want to be careful about how I say this, because it's easy to be sneering, and I don't think sneering is right. A small historical society with no money found itself holding a demolished farmhouse. They could burn the lumber, or they could turn it into something people would pay for and use the money to keep 2 other buildings standing. They chose the second thing. But it does mean that Grace's house isn't in one place. It's in several hundred drawers, in several hundred towns, and most of the people holding those pieces no longer know which sister lived in it. Manchester is gone too. On the 24th of June, 2003, an F4 tornado came through and took the town off the map. 6 people lived there by then. 3 were hurt. Storm researchers were out that day and filmed it, and the image ran on the cover of a national magazine. There's a memorial there now, and the old town pump. So that's Grace. A house sold by the slice and a town erased by weather, and if you drive out there today, the most solid thing in the landscape is a hand pump, with nothing attached to it. Carrie's went by fire. She had lived in Keystone since 1911, and she died in 1946, and her house stood on in the town another 20-odd years until it burned in the 1970s. There's a general store on the ground now, the Keystone Mercantile. But Carrie was the one who kept things. She'd been the family's archivist without anybody appointing her to it. She took her mother's house. She took Mary in, and when the others died, their belongings and their papers came to her, and she didn't throw them out. Think what that actually involved. A woman in her 60s and 70s, a small house in a mining town, boxes of her dead family's letters and dishes and photographs, and every practical reason in the world to clear some of it out. She kept it. Those papers and objects are in Keystone still, in the Old Town School, in a display the Historical Society calls Carrie's Corner. So the sister nobody remembers is the reason a great deal of this family is remembered at all. And now the cemetery. Because there's something in that cemetery that took me a long time to believe. The Smet cemetery was organised in 1881. 10 acres, bought from a man named Jacob Hopp for $150, and the town didn't finish paying for that ground until 1885. They were still paying off the graveyard while people were being buried in it. The Ingalls family lies in Block 44, Lot 9. Charles, Caroline, Mary, Carrie. Grace is nearby with her husband, close to the family row, but not in it. Here is the thing. Until 1958, only Charles had a stone. Carolyn had been in the ground 34 years, Mary 30, Carrie 12, and there was one marker standing over that lot, cut in 1902, with one name on it. Why would a family leave its own mother unmarked for 34 years? It didn't. That's what happens when the people who would have ordered the stones are already in the ground. Carrie was the last one who could have done it. And then Carrie was dead too. In 1958, a year after Laura died, Rose Wilder Lane paid to have her grandfather's headstone recut. And the newly formed memorial group set markers for Caroline, for Mary, and for the baby who died in 1889. Carrie's marker was replaced so that it would match the others. 5 stones sit in a line now, set in concrete, across 6 burial plots. And the baby's stone may not be over the baby. He was born on the 11th of July, 1889. The De Smet paper announced him in a single line about a 10-pound boy at A.J. Wilder's on Thursday night. He died on the 7th of August, and 4 weeks after the first notice, the same paper ran 3 lines about his death. He was never named, and the undertaker's burial book for that stretch of years has never been found, which means that when they set a marker for him in 1958, they were making a reasonable guess about where a 4-week-old baby had been put in the ground 69 years before. It's probably the right spot. Nobody alive can prove it. Charles's own inscription was recut again in 2021, and even now the line beneath his death date is barely readable. So, who mows it? There's a collection box near the graves. That's how the grass gets cut. Now, I've been putting off the fiddle, And it's time. Everybody who has read these books knows the fiddle. It's in all of them. It's what happens after the work is finished and before the lamp goes out. In 1937, speaking to an audience in Detroit, Laura talked about her father's violin and about the evenings it filled. The instrument survives. It's in a case at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri tonight. The family story is that Charles told Laura he wanted her to have it. The version usually told puts that conversation on the night before Laura and Almanzo drove out of Smet for Missouri in July of 1894, which would have been close to the last time she saw her father in health. Now let me be straight with you about what comes next, because the honest answer is more interesting than the tidy one. The route that Fiddle took from Smet to Mansfield isn't properly documented. There's a well-known account among researchers. It says that after their mother and their sister died, Grace and Carrie gave the fiddle to the South Dakota State Historical Society. That the gift carried a condition that the instrument be displayed prominently and played at least 4 times every year. That the condition wasn't kept, and that when the museum at Mansfield was getting started, Rose borrowed it, and the society didn't value it enough to chase her, and it never went back. I haven't been able to find a deed of gift, an accession record, or a newspaper notice for any of that. Another account says simply that Laura kept the fiddle her whole life. Both of those can't be true, and I'm not going to pretend to you that I know which is. What is certain is the object, and the object is worth more than the story. Open the case. The case is from about 1850. Inside the violin there's a paper label, and the label invokes the name Amati and Cremona, which is the most famous violin-making city in the world. It isn't an Amati. It's a mass-produced German trade instrument from the middle of the 1800s, the kind sold cheaply by the thousand to people who would never see Italy. So which is it? A treasure or a cheap instrument that got lucky? Both. Pa's fiddle is a factory violin wearing a borrowed name, and I think that's close to perfect, because so was he. A man with no capital and no luck who could make a room full of hungry people feel like they were somewhere else for an hour. Look at the fingerboard. It's a soft wood, and it's worn down where his fingers went. Year after year in Wisconsin and Kansas and Minnesota and Iowa and Dakota territory. Look at the back of the instrument. There are scratch marks, and the likeliest explanation is his collar, or the buckle of his suspenders, rubbing there while he played. The pegs still slip when the air is dry. The museum has it restored to playing condition. It's taken out once a year, at Wilder Days in late September, and an old-time fiddler plays it. Once a year. That's it. Except for one thing. There's a short film that runs for visitors at the museum, and the music on that film is Pa's fiddle, which means that in a small room in Missouri, every day the doors are open, all day long, the sound of Charles Ingalls' violin plays on a loop for whoever wanders in out of the heat. He'd have found that funny. I think he would have taken it. And how did he come by the thing in the first place? 2 answers, and they disagree. One says he bought it as a young man in Illinois. The other, which the museum tour tells, says the Ingalls brothers won it as a prize for selling the most seed for a local company. Nobody has settled it, and at this distance nobody is going to. There's one more category of thing, and it turned out to be worth more than every object we've named put together. The papers. When Laura died in 1957, there were manuscripts in that house. There was the final typescript of Little House in the Big Woods, which Harper and Brothers had sent back to her about 6 months after the book came out, the way publishers used to. She kept it. There were the school tablets. She wrote in soft pencil on lined tablets bought from a grocery company in Springfield, the sort of thing a child would use for arithmetic, and she filled them with the childhood of a family that no longer existed. And there was Pioneer Girl. That's the one people who love these books get quiet about. It's the autobiography she wrote first for adults, before any of the novels. About 74,000 words, 350 pages in her own hand, delivered to Rose on the 7th of May, 1930. Nobody would publish it. It was too dark and too plain, and it didn't have a shape publishers understood, so it was cut apart and remade into children's books, and the original went in a drawer. The handwritten one is still at Mansfield, under restricted access. The typed versions ended up in Rose's papers, and Rose's papers ended up somewhere I will come back to shortly, because who put them there is part of the story. In January of 1981, the association loaned the manuscripts to a university in Missouri to be put on microfilm. 3 rolls, 34 folders, a life's work on 3 reels. Now let me stop for a moment and say the thing this whole story keeps circling. There are 2 ways a thing survives you. The first is an heir, somebody with your blood who gets it because of who they are, whether they want it or not. That's how most property is moved for most of human history, and it needs no explanation and no goodwill. It's automatic. The second is a keeper, somebody with no claim on it at all who decides to hold on to it anyway. Heirs are legal, keepers are voluntary. And what makes this family unusual isn't that they were poor, or that they moved a lot, or that a famous author came out of them. Plenty of families have all 3. What makes them unusual is that the first mechanism failed completely. Total failure. 5 children, 3 marriages, 1 surviving grandchild, no great-grandchildren, nothing. And the second mechanism worked anyway. I don't think anybody planned that. I don't think Laura sat down in 1948 and thought, well, the town can have it. What the evidence shows is a series of separate decisions by separate people who mostly didn't know each other. 6 men in Mansfield formed an association 3 days after a funeral, with no money and no idea what they were doing. None of them had to. That's the whole point. Not one of them was going to inherit anything, and not one of them was going to be thanked by anybody with the surname. Why do people do that? Why does a farm wife in the Ozarks give up her Saturdays for 30 years to sell tickets to a house that isn't hers for a family she's not part of, that ended before she was born? I think it's because the story got in early. Because at 9 years old she read about a girl in a wagon, and something about it stuck to the inside of her, and 40 years later here she is with the till. You can't leave that in a will, there's no clause for it, but it turns out to be the only kind of inheritance that reached the 3rd generation. Which brings us back to Rose. Rose Wilder Lane spent the last decade of her life in Danbury, Connecticut, in a house she had made comfortable, writing, arguing with people by letter, and getting old in a way she didn't much care for. She was in her 80s, and she wasn't slowing down. In 1965, at 78, she went to Vietnam as a correspondent, not as a tourist, as a working reporter filing copy in a war zone at 78 years old. And in the fall of 1968, at 81, she booked a trip around the world. Not a holiday, 3 years. She was going to go and keep going and see whether she came back. On the 30th of October, 1968, 4 days before she was due to leave, Rose Wilder Lane died in her sleep at home. She was the last of them. Charles's line, Caroline's line, the whole of it, ended in a bed in Connecticut on an October night, with the trip still 4 days away. They brought her back to Mansfield and buried her near her parents, and then her will was opened, and the part that matters is 1 sentence long. She left everything she owned to. In the will's own words, my friend Roger Lee McBride, my friend. In life she had called him something else. She called him her adopted grandson. Other people repeated it, and it stuck, and you will still read it in print today. He was never adopted. There is no adoption anywhere in the record. It was a description of a feeling, not a fact of law. And when it came to writing the document, she used the accurate word. So who was he? Roger Lee McBride was born on the 6th of August 1929 in New Rochelle, New York. His father was one of Rose's editors. They met when the boy was 14 and Rose was 56. She had no child. He had in her an old woman who took him seriously, wrote him long letters, and gave him a politics. He grew up into exactly the sort of man that upbringing would produce. Princeton, then Harvard Law, practice, Vermont politics. And in 1972 he did something that put his name in the history books for a reason that has nothing to do with this family at all. He was a Republican presidential elector in Virginia. And when the Electoral College met, he refused to cast his vote where he was pledged, and cast it for the Libertarian candidate instead. That single act made the Libertarian vice presidential candidate a woman named Toni Nathan, the first woman in American history to receive an electoral vote. 4 years later, he ran for president himself as the Libertarian nominee, with a running mate named David Bergland. He carried 32 states on the ballot and won none of them. That's who inherited Little House on the Prairie. When Rose died, he was 39 years old, and he was both the executor of her estate and its only beneficiary, which means that on the 30th of October, 1968, everything Laura Ingalls Wilder had ever written passed into the hands of a 39-year-old lawyer from New Rochelle who had never met her, and that was legal, and it was exactly what Rose wanted. I want to be fair to him for a moment, because the easy version makes him a thief, and the record doesn't support that, and you deserve better than a villain. He didn't sit on this material and hide it. Sometime in the 1970s he took Rose's papers. They included the typed drafts of Pioneer Girl and the notebooks of the manuscript that became the first 4 years. He gave the whole lot to a presidential library in Iowa. Any scholar can walk in and read them. He is the reason we can read those drafts. He gave them away. He helped pay for the Fireproof Museum at Rocky Ridge in 1971, the building that's the only reason the tablets and the fragile things are still with us. He donated Rose's own memorabilia to it, and he wrote 8 children's books about Rose's girlhood, published under the Little House name, which sold well and which purists disliked. All of that's true at the same time as everything else I'm about to tell you. He preserved a great deal, and he kept a great deal, and both of those sentences describe the same man. So what happened to the second half of Laura's will? The half that said, after Rose, the library. To understand what happened to it, you need one piece of machinery, and I promise to be quick, because it's boring right up until the moment you see what it did. Under the copyright law of that period, a book was protected for 28 years. At the end of 28 years, somebody had to file a renewal. If they did, the copyright ran another 28. If nobody filed, the book fell out of protection and belonged to everybody. So each of the 8 Little House books had a clock, and each clock was set on the day that book was published. Little House in the Big Woods came out in 1932. Its renewal fell due in 1960. Farmer Boy, Little House on the Prairie, On the Banks of Plum Creek, By the Shores of Silver Lake, The Long Winter, all of the 1930s books. Every one of those renewals fell due between 1960 and 1968. Rose was alive for all of them, and she filed those renewals herself in her own name. That leaves 2 books. Little Town on the Prairie was published in 1941. Its renewal came due in 1969. These Happy Golden Years was published in 1943. Its renewal came due in 1971. Rose died in October of 1968. Do you see it? 6 of the 8 renewals happened while she was alive and went in under her name. The last 2 fell due after she was dead, and McBride filed those. That accident of a calendar, 2 books published during a war instead of before it, turns out to be the only reason anybody could take any of this into a courtroom 30 years later. Nobody planned that. Nobody could have. It's just how the dates fell. Meanwhile, in Mansfield, the library waited. Let me tell you what that library actually was, because it's easy to say the word library and picture marble. It was a branch of the county system in a town of about 1,000 people in the Missouri Ozarks. A room, a card catalogue, a desk, volunteers, hours that depended on who could come in that day. It carried Laura's name, and somebody there knew about the will. The town knew. It wasn't a secret in Mansfield that when Rose died, the book money was coming to the library. Rose was gone by the end of October 1968. 1969 came and went. 1970. 1971. Then, in 1972, a payment arrived. $28,011. Now that was real money for a small library in 1972. It isn't nothing. It would buy shelving and books and repairs and a few years of not worrying. They took it. They used it. And they waited for the next one. There was no next one. 1973, nothing. 1975, nothing. 1980, nothing. 1990, Nothing. And in those same years, something was happening to Laura Ingalls Wilder's books that was bigger than anything that had ever happened to them. In the early 1970s, a television producer named Ed Friendly went looking for the rights. His lawyer found out they were available. He wanted all the books, not one of them, and he went to the man who owned them. McBride flew out to California and they made an agreement. The series went on the air in 1974. It ran 9 seasons, then reruns, then syndication, then dubbed in dozens of countries, on, and somewhere in the world it has been playing more or less continuously for 50 years. Every one of those seasons was licensed from an estate that owed a small library in Missouri the income from those books. And the books themselves stopped being well-regarded children's novels and became an industry. New editions, boxed sets, illustrated editions, cookbooks, craft books, foreign rights in language after language. McBride died on the 5th of March 1995 in Miami Beach of heart failure. He was 65. Everything passed to his daughter, Abigail, and the library in Mansfield, Missouri had received $28,011 once, 23 years earlier. And now, I want you to sit inside those 27 years, because that's the part everybody skips to get to the courtroom. 27 years is a long time in a small town. Think about who was on that library board in 1972 when the check came. Grown adults, probably in their 40s and 50s, people who remembered Mrs. Wilder because she'd only been dead 15 years and Mansfield wasn't a big place. Some of them had almost certainly met her. They banked $28,011 and they were pleased, and they were right to be. And then they waited. By 1980, most of that board was gone, retired, moved away, dead. The new people knew about the will the way you know about anything in a small town, which is that somebody tells you when you take the job. By 1990, the television series had been off the air for 7 years and was still running somewhere in the world every single day. The books were selling by the hundreds of thousands. There were boxed sets in every bookshop in America, and the library in Mansfield, Missouri had a room, a card catalogue, and a photocopier that jammed. Nobody was hiding anything from them. That's worth saying clearly. The information wasn't secret. Anybody could look up who had renewed a copyright. What they didn't have was a lawyer and a plan and the nerve. Because think about what suing actually means for a county library board in the Ozarks. You're not suing a person. You're suing a New York publishing house and the estate of a man who ran for president. Those people have a law firm on a retainer. You have a budget for periodicals. If you lose, you've spent public money on a losing case in a small town where everybody will know, and where some of them will say you should have been buying books with it. So for 27 years, the sensible thing to do was nothing. And then, at some point in the late 1990s, somebody stopped agreeing that nothing was sensible. I don't know who. The record doesn't name the person who first said out loud in a meeting that they ought to find out. It might have been a librarian. It might have been a board member. It might have been somebody's cousin who happened to be a lawyer. But somebody, in a room with a card catalogue in it, decided that a dead woman's instruction was worth asking a court about. That's the moment everything turns, and it has no name attached to it. Now, I said I wasn't going to hand you a villain, and I meant it. So here is the fairest statement of the problem I can make. The will was clear about what should happen after Rose. Whether it was clear about the mechanism is a different question, and it's the question lawyers fight about. Because a copyright isn't a farm. You can't leave somebody the income from a copyright as simply as you can leave them a chair. Renewal terms. Whose name goes on the filing? What a life interest actually reaches when the underlying property has to be renewed by somebody. All of that's genuinely difficult law, and reasonable people took different views of it. What isn't in dispute is the outcome. For 27 years, the beneficiary named in Laura Ingalls Wilder's will received nothing, while the property she had left it earned a great deal of money for other people. Eventually, somebody in Mansfield decided that was worth asking about. In October of 1999, the board of the Wright County Library filed suit. And look at what they actually asked for, because it tells you exactly who they were. They didn't ask for the copyrights. They didn't ask to stop anybody publishing anything. They said so specifically. They didn't want the books off the shelves. They asked for an accounting. They asked a judge to make somebody sit down and set out who owned what and who owed what to whom. That's a librarian's lawsuit. That's a request for the record to be put in order. The defendants were Abigail McBride Allen, an attorney named J.B. Cox, and the publisher, HarperCollins. The case ran in two places at once, federal court in Kansas City and probate court. Both of them had to be satisfied before anything could be settled, which meant everything took twice as long and cost twice as much, and a county library board in the Ozarks was paying for it. In 2000, the federal judge dismissed the library's claims to 6 of the 8 books. 6. The 1930s books, the ones Rose had renewed in her own name while she was alive. So the library was down to 2. Little Town on the Prairie and These Happy Golden Years, the 2 whose renewal dates had fallen on the wrong side of an old woman's death. Then, in January of 2001, the probate judge ruled that on those 2 books, the library did have a legitimate claim. And 3 months after that, on the 10th of April, 2001, the parties announced a settlement. HarperCollins, the estate of Roger Lee McBride, and his daughter, agreed to pay the library $875,000. They admitted no liability, and they didn't call it a settlement. In the announcement, the payment was described as a contribution. One of the attorneys involved, quoted in the news reports at the time, put it like this: "I guess if we all want to call that a contribution, we're free to do so. So did the library win? No. Nobody won." That word, contribution, is the closest thing to a verdict anybody ever got. $875,000 out of an estate built on 8 books, 44 years after the woman who wrote them signed a will leaving the money to a room with a card catalogue in it. The family kept the copyrights. They have them still. The library got a building. That's where the money went. Into shelving and walls and a facility in Mansfield, Missouri, for a town of 1,000 people. And the reason that building is the size it is comes down to 2 novels published during the Second World War, instead of before it. There's no ongoing payment. One sum, once, and then it was finished. And there's one more thing the estate did with what it owned, and it's the strangest part of the whole arrangement. It kept publishing her. Laura Ingalls Wilder died in 1957, having published 8 books. Since then, under her name, 4 more have come out. She wrote all of them. She published none of them. Everyone was brought out by somebody who wasn't related to her. Start with the diary. In 1894, on the wagon trip from Smet to Missouri, Laura kept a small notebook. Distances, weather, what things cost, what the land looked like. It was a working record, not a literary one, and she never did anything with it. Rose found it and published it in 1962, 5 years after her mother died, with her own account of the journey wrapped around it. It's called On the Way Home, so her daughter published her dead mother's private notebook. You can decide for yourself how you feel about that. What I'd say is that without her doing it, we wouldn't have a single line of what Laura actually wrote down while it was happening. Then the one nobody knew existed. When Rose died in 1968, McBride went through her papers, and in them he found a manuscript in Laura's hand that nobody had published and almost nobody had read. It was about the first 4 years of the marriage, the wheat that failed, the debt, the diphtheria, the baby who died in August, the house that burned. It's bleak, and it's unfinished, and it doesn't sound like the other books at all. It reads like a woman writing something down for herself so that it'd exist somewhere. He published it in 1971, the first 4 years, 14 years after she died, 3 years after her daughter died, by a man she never met, who was under no obligation to publish anything. Then in 1974 he brought out her letters. In 1915 she went out to San Francisco to visit Rose and see the World's Fair. She wrote home every few days, to a man on a farm in Missouri who wasn't going to come. That book is called West from Home, and it's her private voice. and she never meant a single word of it to be printed. And then, 40 years after that, the last one, Pioneer Girl, the autobiography she wrote in 1930, in pencil, on grocery store tablets, the one nobody would touch. In 2014, a small state historical society press in South Dakota published it, annotated with the permission of the trust that owns her copyrights. They expected to sell it to scholars and enthusiasts. It sold out. Then it sold out again. A heavy, footnoted academic edition of an 84-year-old unpublished manuscript by a dead children's author went into reprint after reprint and turned into one of the best-selling books that press had ever handled. 84 years. She wrote it, put it away, wrote something else instead, and died. Her daughter died. Her daughter's heir died. And then a state historical society in a state she had left in 1894 brought it out and people queued for it. 4 books after her death, and not one published by anybody with her blood in them. There's a footnote to all of this that belongs here, because it's also part of what happened to what she left. In 1954, 3 years before she died, the American Library Association created a medal for lifetime achievement in children's literature and named it after her. She was its first recipient. It was the only major award she ever personally received. In 2018, the association's children's division voted to take her name off it. It's now called the Children's Literature Legacy Award. Their stated reason was that passages in the books express stereotypical attitudes about Native and Black Americans that are inconsistent with the values they want the medal to stand for. People who objected argued that a 1930s text should be read in its own century and that the books should be taught with their problems rather than quietly renamed around. Both of those are arguments people make in good faith, and I'm not going to settle them for you tonight. What I'll point out is the mechanical thing. There was nobody left to be asked. No son, no granddaughter, no family with a stake in her name, sitting at a table, being consulted. The estate owns the words. It doesn't speak for the woman. And if you want to know what $875,000 looks like, you can go and stand in it. There's a library building in Mansfield, Missouri, with her name on it. Shelves, computers, chairs, air conditioning that works in an Ozark August. Children's Hours is the single most ordinary building in this entire story, and it's the only one Laura Ingalls Wilder actually chose. Everything else we've walked through tonight was chosen for her. The Shorters bought the farm because it was for sale. Rose bought the house back because her mother had died in it. Committees preserved what they preserved because they happened to be standing there. But the library is the one thing she named herself, in writing, on purpose, when she had every other option available to a woman with money and no heirs. She could have endowed a prize. She could have left it to a university or a church, or set up something with her name on a letterhead. She left it to the room where a 9-year-old could take a book off a shelf without paying for it. It took 44 years and a lawsuit for that to mean anything. But it's there. So who owns Laura Ingalls Wilder tonight? The copyrights sit with something called the Little House Heritage Trust. The State Historical Society of Missouri says so in its own finding aid. So does the South Dakota Historical Society Press. Who the trustees are isn't public information. The trademark on the words Little House for the book series belongs to HarperCollins, filed in 1992, renewed twice since. The trademark on Little House on the Prairie, for television and merchandise and everything that comes with it, belongs to a company called Friendly Family Productions. It's run by a man named Trip Friendly. His father was Ed Friendly, the producer who flew Roger McBride out to California in the early 1970s and bought the screen rights from him. On the 9th of July this year, a new television version of A Little House on the Prairie began streaming, produced by that same family company. So the line runs like this. Laura wrote the books. Laura left them to Rose for Rose's lifetime, and after Rose, to the library. Rose left them to a friend. The friend sold the screen rights to a producer. The producer's son licensed them again 50 years later. Every image of the Ingalls family that has reached the world since 1974 has come down that chain. And the chain begins with one line written into a will by a childless woman in Connecticut. There's one last thing on the ownership question, and it's a clock nobody can stop. American copyright now runs 95 years from publication. Little House in the Big Woods was published in 1932, which means that on the 1st of January 2028, 17 months from tonight, the first Little House book stops belonging to anybody. No trust, no publisher, no estate. Anyone will be able to print it, read it aloud, put it on the radio, or make a film of it, and nobody will have to ask. In Canada, it happened years ago. The book is already free there, and you can read it online tonight if you want to. And then the others follow, one at a time, across the 12 years after that, until the whole shelf has come loose. The family had no heirs. In the end, the books won't have an owner either. There's one more thing to say about all this, and it isn't comfortable, so I'll say it plainly and then let it go. None of it is safe. We've spent tonight watching strangers catch things the family couldn't hold, and they did catch them, and they've held on for 70 years, and that's remarkable. But look at what's actually holding it up. 8 small non-profit societies, volunteer boards, admission money, gift shops, bake sales, a grant here and there, buildings that are 140 years old and need roofs, and the people doing it are old. That's not a criticism. It's just what a volunteer historical society is in a small town in America in 2026. The woman who's run the till on Saturdays for 30 years is in her 70s now, and the person coming up behind her may or may not exist. Small museums close. It happens constantly, and it barely makes the local paper. The collection gets split, some to a bigger institution, some to auction, and a good deal of it into somebody's garage. There is no endowment behind most of this. There is no family in the background with money and a reason to care. The trust that owns the copyrights owns words. It doesn't own a single one of these buildings, and it isn't responsible for a single roof. So here's where we actually are. The books will be fine. Books are the easiest thing in the world to preserve, and in 17 months the first one stops needing anybody's permission at all. It's the objects that are fragile. The bread plate that came out of the fire, the chest of drawers he made, the desk with the hole in it, Mary's 9-patch quilt pieced by somebody who couldn't see the colours. Those exist because a specific person in a specific town decided this year to keep going. That decision has to be made again next year. And the year after that. Nobody inherits it. Somebody just has to choose. Before we finish, we should go and stand in the other cemetery, because this family is buried in 2 states and almost nobody says so out loud. The Mansfield cemetery is about 1.5 miles from the farmhouse, up on a rise, and there are 3 stones in it that matter here. Almanzo, 1949. Laura, 1957. Rose, 1968. 3 graves. 19 years between the first and the last. And then nothing, because that's the end of the list. There's no 4th stone waiting. There was never going to be one. 900 miles north into Smet there are 5 more. Charles, Carolyn, Mary, Carrie, and a marker for a baby that may or may not be over the baby. Grace lies a little way off with her husband. 8 people, 2 graveyards, 2 states, and the 8 of them are the whole family. You could walk both cemeteries in an afternoon each, and you would have seen everyone who ever sat at that table. The De Smet ground gets mown because there's a collection box near the graves, and roughly 25,000 people a year come to the farm at the bottom of that hill. A good number of them drive up afterwards. They stand in front of the 3 stones. Ask yourself who those people are, because I've read what they write in the visitor books and what they say in the comments under videos like this one, and the pattern is very consistent, and it isn't what you'd expect. They aren't scholars. A few are. Most aren't. They're women in their 60s and 70s who read these books at 9 years old under a blanket, then read them to their own children, then to somebody else's children in a classroom for 30 years. They're men who came because their wife wanted to, and who stood in the kitchen longer than she did. They're people who drove 4 hours out of their way on a trip to somewhere else. And a surprising number are people whose own grandparents homesteaded. They came because these books are the closest thing they've got to a written record of their own family. Nobody ever wrote theirs down. That's who keeps this. Not descendants. Substitutes. 25,000 a year in a town of 1,000 on a gravel road in Wright County, Missouri. None of them are relatives. All of them behave like relatives. So let's finish where we started, and let's be accurate about it, because there's a version of this ending that's angrier than the facts deserve, and I'm not going to give you that one tonight. Here's what actually happened to everything the Ingalls family owned. Count it up, and here's what you find. This family had no descendants, not one. The last of that blood died in a Connecticut bedroom in 1968, 4 days short of a journey around the world, and almost nothing was lost. A grocer kept it. A farm couple sold a house back at a fair price when they didn't have to. A woman in a mining town kept a box she could easily have burned. A library board waited 27 years and then asked a court a polite question. Not one of those people was an Ingalls. Inheritance is supposed to run down a family line. When the line stops, you'd expect the things to stop with it. They don't, because things don't need blood. They need somebody standing nearby who decides not to let go. That's what happened here. A family that couldn't pass anything to a child passed it, without ever intending to a town, and then to several towns, and then to strangers and cars coming up a gravel road in Missouri and a 2-lane highway in South Dakota year after year to stand in a kitchen and look at a stove. Which brings us back to the contract on the table. Laura sold her house and kept the right to die in it. Think about what that actually was. It wasn't defeat, and it wasn't sentiment. It was a woman looking clearly at the arithmetic of her own family, seeing that the count came to 1, and deciding to put the burden down while she was still strong enough to choose where it landed. She couldn't leave a farm to a daughter who had nobody to pass it to either, so she let it go to people who would work it. She stayed on in the middle of it, and she spent her last years answering letters from other people's children until her hand gave out. That's not a woman losing her home, that's a woman placing it. In that speech in Detroit in 1937, when she was 70 and had 4 books out and the rest still to come, she described the evenings, sitting in the twilight or by the lamp, listening to her father's stories and the music of his violin. She was describing a room in a house that doesn't exist anymore, in a family that ended, on land that belongs to other people now. And tonight in Mansfield, Missouri, that violin is lying in a case from 1850. There's a false Italian name on a paper label inside it. The wood of the fingerboard is worn away where his fingers went, and the pegs still slip when the air is dry. It gets played once a year. Good night.